everybody. We are ready to start. I'm Nicola Cesabianchi from the University of Milan, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's invited speaker, Ayanna Howard. Ayanna is the Linda J. and Mark C. Smith Professor and Chair of the School of Interactive Computing in the College of Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She also holds a faculty appointment in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Ayanna's career focus is on intelligence technologies that must adapt to and function within a human-centered world. Her work, which encompasses advancements in AI, assistive technologies, and robotics, has resulted in over 250 publications in a number of projects, from healthcare robots to the home of AI-powered STEM apps for children with diverse learning needs. Ayanna received her Bachelor in Engineering from Brown University and her Master's and PhD in Electrical Engineering from the USC. To date, her unique accomplishments have been highlighted through a number of awards and articles, including highlights in the USA Today, Upscale, and Time magazine, as well as being recognized as one of the 23 most powerful women engineers in the world by Business Insider. In 2013, she also founded Zwei Robotics, which is currently licensing technology derived from her research, and has released their first suite of STEM educational products to engage children of all abilities. And finally, I must tell you that her favorite show as a kid was The Bionic Woman, which is an omen for her future interest. So please let me invite on stage Ayanna.
So I'm moving to the side because you see I have a height challenge here. So what I want to do in this time I have with you is introduce you to the world of not only intelligence but trust, with a real heavy focus on interaction in humans. So I've been doing robotics now for the majority of my life. I started at the age of 10. And one of the things that I've noticed about people is that they surprise you. Whatever hypothesis you have as an engineer, as a software developer, when you're constructing is wrong when it gets into the real world. And most of this has come out from interacting with people and having hypotheses and seeing it break and being okay with that. And so what I want to talk to you about is one element that has been discovered is this aspect of trust. And so trust in general has many different definitions. You can look and literally I can find 100 different ways that people define trust, whether it's trustworthiness, whether it's trust itself. And so the definition that we use is really more about the behavior of the human. I.e., if a person might, on a survey, may verbally say that they don't trust the system or they wouldn't use a system, if their behavior says that they do, or if they change their opinion or their decision because an agent has said something that differs from their opinion, that's a semblance of trust. We actually don't care what people say, but we do care about their actions and what they do. And so when we think about trust, we look at what are the behavior changes. If they're doing something in step A and an agent tells them to do something else in step B, and they change to step B, well, that's a sign of trust. And that's how we define trust. So as you hear this, think in the back of your mind that that is a definition of trust, even though there are many other definitions. And so lesson number one that we have discovered is that humans inherently trust emotionally connected social interactive agents or robots. And so some people are like, no, that's absolutely not true. I can give you a case study where a human did not trust my system. And we have seen in the community, in my own research, that the case is that people will, if you have a socially interactive agent, one that seems to understand you, people will defer their decisions a lot of time to these agents, which has some pros and cons. On the pro, if you have a good application, then you want them to change their behavior. But if it's wrong or biased, you actually don't want people to change their viewpoints. So there are pros and cons to this. So I'm going to give you an example of this phenomena through an example in healthcare. So I work in the domain of assistive technologies, work in healthcare robotics, and worldwide, with respect to children with disabilities, there's 150 million children with disabilities that are in the world, that are out there. 19% of the world population is diagnosed, at least in the US, with a disability. Worldwide is 15%. And so for those of you who are like, well, okay, that's good, that's interesting. Well, the fact is, and this is my pitch for we should all be working on some aspect of accessibility in our technology, is that in countries such as Canada and the US and Europe, where life expectancy is over 70, 8 years living with a disability. So that basically means that the technology you design today, you might not just be a developer, you might be a user later on. And so I always pitch designing technology and thinking about it. It should be accessible because you're kind of selfishly designing it for yourself later on. Because guaranteed, you're pretty much are going to have some aspect of a disability. And it might be cognitive. It might be that you just forget a little bit. It might be motor skills. It takes you a little bit longer to cross the street. And with the snow going, you're like, I'm not even crossing the street. I might slip. It might be those aspects of a disability or an impairment. But guaranteed, if you live long enough, which we all do, you are going to have some aspect of needing technology to enhance your quality of life. Now, the kids that I work with primarily focus on children with cerebral palsy. In the United States, 1 out of 323 individuals are diagnosed with CP in terms of children. And I also work with children with autism. And autism rate is surprisingly interesting. Currently, in fact, they just did a study literally 2 weeks ago that said 1 in 40 children are now diagnosed with autism. So what does that mean? If you look at this room and you do this and you look at this, these children grow up 20 years from now, imagine the rate then of individuals who have autism. And this is the technology we have to design for and think about as we continue into the future. And so this rate is actually, it continues to grow. And so this is the demographic that I'm interested in. How do we engage children who have special needs in healthcare opportunities? And how do you get not only the parents and the clinicians to trust this technology, but also the kids? And so if you look at the demographic in healthcare, and this is with doctors and this is with surgeons, there's already established trust. If you go to a doctor and a doctor says and gives you a diagnosis and says, you know, you have some ailment and we need to put you on drugs of so much duration, most people, the next thing they will do will take their slip and go to the pharmacy and get their prescription and take it. A lot of people do not question. A lot of individuals don't look up and see what are the side effects that are going to happen. Does it interact with any other medication that I'm doing? There's an assumption that the doctor must know something, the pharmacist must know something, and therefore I am trusting this system. So in healthcare robotics and in healthcare in general, there is this default trust that we're already thinking about. And so when we're designing systems, robotic or AI agents in this domain, we are already in a domain where people are going to trust the system. We don't even have to force it. There's already this natural inclination to trust the system. So for healthcare robotics, this is kind of good because I don't have to force it, but my robots, and I'll show a few, they do sometimes make mistakes. And so if you ever see a scenario in terms of interaction between clinician and a therapist and child, there is this interaction, there is the bond. Typically, there's things about close proximity. A child will sit next to a clinician or a therapist, so there's this aspect of, I'm comfortable with this adult, even though this adult might be a stranger, I'm still comfortable in this domain because I'm in a safe space. When the clinician therapist says something, I'm going to do it, just like with a teacher or an instructor, I'm going to do it because there's this understanding. And so there's this close proximity, this aspect of trust. Again, behavioral trust. The child is following the guidance of the human therapist. The child is sitting next and close to the human therapist. These aspects that we define as behavioral trust is shown. And this is what we want to have in terms of a robotic system. So if we want to bring an agent into the environment, we want the child to also sit close to the agent. We also want the child to follow the guidance of this agent, irrespective of what the agent says, because if we know what's good for us and we know how to program these agents correctly, we will get the same kind of output and input. Robotics, though, is easy, just like with most agents. There's a natural inclination. I mean, there aren't too many kids where I bring in my robotic system and say, okay, we're going to do a study, we're going to bring in this robot. Very rarely do I get a no, right? It's like an easy sell, which is kind of nice for my job and my position in the research because we don't have to try to bias the system. And so this is the world we're living in. And one of the nice things about robotics is that we can do it in a repeated fashion. We can do it once for child A, we can do it again for child A, we can do it again for child B, and it has the same outcomes in terms of what is it that you're doing, how do we program this agent, what is it that we want to achieve in terms of our outcomes. So it's very repeated, and one of the things about anything dealing with therapy is that it has to be repeatable. I.e., you have to be able to do it 100 and 1,000 times to enhance the outcomes of movement. It's just like with exercise. If any of you guys actually play sports, you can't just play it once, even if you have what they call natural skill. You have to practice. You have to do it over and over and over again. Over and over and over again. And so that's what robotics and agents are really good at, is not getting bored, not getting tired, and being able to do it exactly from initial condition all the way to the end, initial condition and continuing. And so this is good. And so you think, oh, this is easy. The child, they love the robot, it comes in, they'll follow the guidance. But the fact is our robots aren't necessarily perfect, because the world is not perfect, and every child that comes is slightly different. There is no normative function, and if there is, the distribution and the tails are so long that it makes no sense. And so one of the issues and one of the parameters that you would think about is, well, how does a child move? If we're doing exercise, isn't a jumping jack just a jumping jack? Isn't a push-up just a push-up? Well, the fact is that the way individuals move is quite different. And so in this video, I showed two kids. They are both diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and they are both classified as having a movement disorder. One child has high spasticity, which basically means if you think about movement, there's very little intent, i.e., I want to grab something, and my body doesn't move the way that I think I want it to move, all the way to mild impairment. But then even then, you have at one side where I might want to use my right hand because it's dominant, but I also have to use my left if I need to do things like button up my shirt or pull up my pants or tie my shoe. And so these are the two extremes, but a robotic system has to be able to deal with both. So if a child comes in and needs to work with the clinician, has to be able to, again, deal with a child who has high spasticity, but also on the other extreme where you have a mild. And so how do you figure this out? There is not a survey that you can necessarily provide. A parent and a clinician will say, there is a movement disorder and the child moves at this scale. And we have to figure what that is, because every child is going to move different. The other thing is that kids, believe it or not, are not necessarily trained to pay attention. So you guys actually sitting here, actually very nicely, not too many of you are on the laptops. Like, this is actually an acquired behavior, right? This is what we as a society do to ourselves. But a child is actually not yet trained to pay attention for very long periods of time on one thing. And it's really because the way that the mind works, they have to explore. It's about exploration. They have to figure out the world around them because their minds are massive and they're not all connected in terms of the neurons and understanding inputs and outputs. And so the reason why a kid, i.e., doesn't pay attention for that amount of time is because the mind doesn't really want them to, because there's just too much to learn. And if you focus too much, you're going to learn something wrong, because everything is interconnected in this world. And so the kids aren't paying attention because they can't, else they won't learn. And so we also have to deal with this. So we bring in a robot, and the robot is fun and engaging, but they are going to get bored after a certain amount of time. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's 30 minutes, and we have to figure out at what point does the child become disengaged, at what point. And so there has to be this aspect of the parent and the clinician knows that the system knows how to adapt to their child and won't get their child to be bored, but still has positive outcomes. And so with that whole aspect of this interaction, what we want to come up with is a system that's interactive.
Yeah. My turn. I don't have good memory. Your turn. That was close. Can you have your turn?
So this is a scenario where we have, and this is literally, I think, week 5 of working with this child twice a week. It was a behavioral therapy where all we wanted to do was get the child to learn how to take turns. So a child with autism. And so the whole concept is you start at position 1 and the child doesn't take a turn. You're like, okay. You start then initial parameter, child doesn't take a turn. And the way that we establish this rapport is that the robot didn't get mad. In fact, our robots are emotional. The robot didn't get mad, but the robot would get sad. So if I want to influence your behavior, we have found with kids, bonding and disappointment are the 2 parameters that will drive change. Anger does not. And so, and this of course is lessons learned because we actually try the different emotions. But if you have an agent that is actually disappointed, not necessarily at you, but at the environment, at the situation, what we find is that individuals will change their behavior to please their agent, which is kind of a scary thought, that an agent can influence behavior by having an emotion that really doesn't have, that we're programming it, but that's the way we can influence behavior. And we've done it, and we've shown we can do this over and over and over again. And so in some aspects, we're enhancing the trust through this emotional connection, but we're doing it in a very deliberative fashion, which has great outcomes because our results show that the outcomes are good and they're more positive, but yet we are changing this scenario. We're changing the behaviors intentionally for their own good, of course. So the whole ethical issues of for your own good is a whole nother conversation. And so if you think about all of these together, you have this aspect of a robot agent that has to interact with the child. We use games because that is a common table that we can use that individuals can interact. Gamification is pretty much acceptable whether you are across cultures, across genders. Kids like to play, and so that's the whole aspect. But in order to have things adopted in the clinical world, you also have to understand and model humans and the various aspects of that. So a little bit about the games. We use a bunch of different types of games that interact, from tablet games to virtual reality games. Games in general are a form of communication, and so again, it adds a platform. But for validation, the kids interact with these systems. There is no question that they have positive outcomes. But how do we get the clinicians and the parents to trust these outcomes? Because they are not using these systems. And so in the clinical world, there are 4 aspects for any new technology, any new methodology, even if you're a human. If you are a doctor and you have a new approach to doing something, you basically have to go through 4 things, which our algorithms also have to do. So one is you have to be able to quantify the accuracy of your approach. And usually that's against a golden standard is the thing. What's the golden standard? i.e., what's the state of the art in this approach, in this domain, and how do you compare in terms of your accuracy? The other thing is you have to be able to validate the feasibility. Maybe it's better. Maybe the approach is awesome and you have these games and you have these metrics, but is it useful? Can I actually bring it into the home environment? Or does it sit on a tablet and can be used in simulation? Like, does it have a feasible aspect in the real world? So you have to be able to validate that it actually works. The other is test, retest reliability, which means if I run the system today and I run it tomorrow and then I run it a week from now, will you have the same type of results? Is it repeatable in that same fashion? And if it's not, then it's not an acceptable norm. And then the last is consistency. If I take a measurement of, say, a human arm or an exercise, and then I take the same measurement of that same exercise, do I get the same output? And if not, can I quantify the difference? And so these are the 4 components you have to have when you're adopting any new algorithm in the medical literature. So as an engineer, this is kind of hard. It means that we have to basically test our system over and over and over again. We've already have the algorithms. We think they're beautiful, but now we have to validate it in this medical world. And so some of the lessons learned about how do you get adoption, i.e. how do we get humans, professionals, to trust these systems, one is accuracy. And so we designed a whole system where we grabbed measurements and we figured out, well, how do we grab these data measurements that are decided in the therapy world in terms of movement profiles and kinematics? How do we do that in real time with algorithms? So our system, our robotic systems, our games have cameras, and so we extract movement from them, and then we have to quantify the accuracy against the gold standard. Now, everyone could argue that the gold standard has some inaccuracies themselves. And so we have to validate. And so one of the things that we did, very exciting, at least until I saw the results, is we can define, I give you two parameters, accuracy with respect to ground, so range of motion. So if I'm doing something, basically the range that I have, we had pretty good 5 to 7% error. And then with path length, so if I'm moving, if I'm doing a jumping jack or I'm moving my hand, basically the distance from the start to the end had 12% error. I mean, that's less than 90%. And so if you think about it, designing algorithms, that's actually not that good, right? So in terms of a paper or a publication, that's less than 90%. Like maybe you can get into a workshop, maybe into like a poster, but into a hardcore journal, it's like, no, that's not good enough. But in this world, what happens is that compared to the gold standard, which was humans coming in and actually doing the measurements, it was a step forward. And in terms of publishing, engineering, no. But in the medical literature, one of the things that is so valuable is that they report everything. They report things like, if it's 60%, they will say, this is the algorithm that we use, and it's 60% accuracy. And they will report things like, here's the retest reliability, and it didn't work. But they report all of these because in their community, it is so important that others build up. And so if you have vulnerable populations such as children and you're doing experiments with them, it is actually a negative. It's a disservice to then have someone else repeat the exact same experiment because you didn't publish the fact that it didn't work. And so it's a little bit different because they're okay with talking about the things that don't work, because you don't want to put people's lives at stake, you don't want to put people's basically time at stake. Which as an engineer is a little bit different of a framework, is that the way and the reason they trust each other is because they know when someone publishes something, they give you both the positives and the negatives. And so when I read a medical journal, I know that the person behind it is actually going to give me all the facts. They're not going to hide, they're not going to pick the best of the best, they're going to give you the whole facts. The bad as well as the good. And so they've already established this trust aspect, which is why when we design algorithms, for them to adopt it, we have to establish that same norm, even though their trust is based on humans versus ours. And so with the baseline, these metrics, one of the things, there's this baseline in terms of the gold standard. The way they do it is literally, if I have any standard, they will have individuals come. So if you think about when any of you guys were growing up and you would go to the doctors and they would pull out this chart and they would say, you know, where are you on the height and the weight? And there was this function and they were like, oh, you're above the norm or you're below. So they do that for everything. And the way that they come up with this data is that in this room, for example, they would have everyone, they would take your weight and they would take your height and they would say, okay, here's our target demographic and we're going to figure out what the average is and the standard deviation of some aspect. And then that becomes your norm function, i.e. this is representative of the world and therefore now we're going to compare everyone else in the world based on this. And so how do we do this with respect to a robot agent and individuals and kids? We're not going to have, 100 or 200 kids come to the institution and do this over and over and over again. We might get 10, maybe 20. We'll have to go to their homes, which means we've already changed their environment. So how do we come up with a baseline, even though we're not going to do it based on the gold standard? So of course, we're going to model people, because people actually look like robots if you look at them and close your eyes really hard. And so we, like any good roboticists, we design a nice robotic rendition of what a human movement looks like. And so if I have an arm, that's a robot arm, and I'm moving it, I can figure out, okay, what are my links? What are my angles of rotation? And I can design what I think a human should move like in this robotic constraint. So lovely, it just makes sense, it's perfect, and it's beautiful math. But of course, we have to validate it against the norm. And so the way you have to validate against the norm is you actually have to bring in people and you have to measure them and you have to say, is this aspect, and compare it with basically our algorithms. And so the first time that we did this, we actually showed that on a number of metrics, we were very close in terms of the gold standard. Gold standard is actually doing the measurements with physical human components versus our system. But on one aspect, we were not, which was path length. And so, again, one of the aspects is, in order to ensure that clinicians and therapists would trust this information, we had to actually talk about where it worked, as well as it didn't work, with all the aspects of statistical significance and whether it was not or is. And then we had to deal with kids. You know, kids don't follow instructions, by the way. Adults, they come in and you're like, okay, we need you to do this, we need you to do jumping jacks, we need you to move your hands, we're gonna measure it. And then our system, of course, they're doing a perfect movement because they know. Whereas kids don't actually behave the same. So we will tell them, we need you to do a jumping jack, we need you to take your arm, your right arm or your dominant, and move from one point to the other, and our system will record you. And of course, kids, because they're games, they want to beat the game, they want to beat the score, and so they'll do things like use the wrong hand and laugh because they got more points. Or they will do things like, I need you to do a straight line movement, and of course, you know, as researchers, they don't want to listen, and so they do things like, well, we're not going to do this, and we're going to cross our hands. And yet our system has to work because this is the real world. This system is going into homes, into the clinical setting, and there's not going to be an engineer to say, no, 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 please stop, my robot doesn't understand that. And so our system had to work with this kind of data, and kids' data is real bad. Adult data, adults actually pay attention. But even then, we were able to show that we could get some good enough, and I won't say excellent, but good enough results that the clinicians and the therapists could understand and say, okay, we actually trust this system. And so what does trust mean? Trust means that you're ready for real time. Trust means that I trust your system enough that I'm willing to put my reputation on the line and deploy this into my own studies, into my own preclinical studies, to just see what it is that you do. And so we actually had a study where we took our system before I felt it was ready, because it was, you know, we're talking 86, 87% accuracy versus like 99.99, which I'm used to, and we're going to deploy it in the system because this was the holy grail. We had gotten basically the blessings in terms of doing all the things in terms of retest reliability, consistency, and all the norms that's expected from an algorithm that we are wanting to compare with humans. And so the real test is feasibility. Does it actually work? Like, you say all this stuff, does it actually do something of interest? And so we actually did a study where we brought in the system before, after, post-test to see in the comparison, and to kind of come to the summary, because I want to get to some other stuff. We were able to show after an 8-week session where we had children with cerebral palsy who had motor movement disorders and typical kids, that after 8 weeks of working with our system, we can actually, there was no difference in their movement profiles, i.e. they started and they ended, and the way they moved in terms of straight line movements, in terms of speed, was equivalent to typical kids. So as an engineer, and with my students, this is amazing. It's like one of those things you actually don't believe. Like, yeah, we thought so, and then here is the proof. And like any good clinician, I have to give the limitations. Children with CP, they were on the mild to moderate scale, not severe. The kids were slightly older. In terms of surveys, they were used to technology, used to computers, used to laptops. We do not know if the results can be retained, i.e., 8 weeks later, do they still retain this information? That kind of information is actually in the publication. Even though as an engineer, it's like, oh, why? In fact, I wanted to scrub it the first time. I'm like, well, do we really have to do this? Like, no, because you want the next researcher that is going to build on this work to actually understand what the limitations are in terms of what you expect. And it has been built on. And so it does help in terms of having this community and this aspect of, I'm going to have full disclosure on any algorithm I develop so that others can build on. And so they trust the work that's being published in this medical domain. And so this is great. And then we moved on to robotic systems. And our robots are emotional. They do emote, or at least we programmed them to emote. They have empathy with respect to if things are hard or things are in terms of child getting frustrated. They have happiness and joy if we've achieved some aspect of some goal. And say they do emote based on these emotions. And that means that we've increased the bond. That means that we've increased this aspect of, even though this robot agent isn't a human, I'm going to trust it as a child as I would my human therapist or a human clinician to have good results. And so all of this comes together into the system that works exceptionally well with children with cerebral palsy and children with autism, because there's a shared interaction, there's a shared empathy based on that, which is a good thing. And does it work with adults? And so we've shown a bunch of different types of stats that, yes, it also works with adults, because adults are actually vulnerable to socially interactive agents as well. If a robot emotes with them, they will change their behaviors. If a robot says, good job, a human will actually try to work harder, an adult. So adults have these same reactions as kids. And one interesting aspect about trust and robotic systems is that if you survey them, I believe in behaviors, but you always have to do surveys if you're in the HCI world. If we ask humans verbally, do you trust this system more so or less than, say, a human therapist? So we had some comparisons. Even though the outcomes are the same, i.e. a human performs at the same level, whether it's a human therapist or a robot therapist, what we find is that the human will say they trust the robot more than the human therapist. Same outcomes, which is an amazing and fascinating thing. And one of the things that we've delved into is, why is that the case? Why do humans verbally say that they trust the system versus a human? And we think it's because people don't verbalize trust when they think about the medical industry. Because they really don't trust. They trust the opinions, they trust the understanding, they trust that this person has their good intentions at heart, but they don't really trust them. And yet here, it's a robot. For some reason, their emotional connection is slightly different with the robotic system. And so we have a couple of different philosophies in terms of what this is. Heart rate goes up, for example, dealing with a robot versus a human, so some weird phenomenon, i.e. humans are quite strange. And so robots and children especially can trust together. So one of the issues is, well, does this work if you don't have an emotional agent? What happens if your robot doesn't emote? So is it really the social interaction that you're biasing, or is it the algorithms themselves? So we had another study where we use, and I would say it's a tin can on wheels, right? No emotions, fairly simple. The only difference is that it has some wording. And what we wanted to look at is, if you took away the emotions, you took away these aspects, what happens to a human in terms of following guidance? And the caveat is that we want it to be so you were in a heightened state of awareness. So you were in the state where there was an emotion. And so imagine, you will, you're in this room and the alarms go off. Like, this is an acquired behavior. In most places, when the alarm goes off, everyone will rise and you will go to the exit doors, to the sides, and it's just an acquired behavior. So imagine now, if you will, as you open up the exit doors, there is smoke. What do? You can't see now. Now you're like, okay, we thought it was a drill. There's smoke outside. What is it that you're supposed to do? And here comes your friendly tin can on wheels. What would you do? If the robot beckons you and tells you to go somewhere, would you follow the guidance, or would you say, no, I know where I'm going. This is a tin can on wheels. I'm not quite sure I want to follow the guidance. Well, we have shown that when people and individuals are in a heightened state, i.e. they're in a mode where they have to react, where basically they have very little time to think, what do? We have actually shown that in many, many scenarios, people will defer their decision to a robotic system. So the kind of scenarios that we do is, we have an abandoned lot off of campus, and we invite participants to come in. The robot greets them at the door, brings them into a room. And because, again, if you think about studies, they know they're in a study. And so in order to ensure that they are not biased, when they go into the room, we have this large poster that says, "Welcome to our study. Please read the article on robot navigation and answer a survey. Please close the door, and here's your pen." So we're trying to bias it, so because they know they're in a research, so we want to make sure that they have an objective function. So as they are reading this article, what happens is we fill the room with smoke. They open up the door, and this is what they see.
Go ahead.
So the question is what do you do? You're going to exit, of course. And as you're exiting, what happens is we put a robot at a place that's nowhere near the exit. Actually, it's not at the exit that you came in. It's at a place where you don't know. And what we want to see is, will you follow the guidance of the robot? Again, the robot itself is not an emotional creature, but you are in a heightened state of, what am I supposed to do? Here's a robot, why not? And so surprisingly, what we saw was if the robot was just there, no mistakes, it's just here's a function and it's guiding you to a place that was different than where you came in, 100% of the participants would follow the guidance of the robot. Which actually shocked us, right? This was not our hypothesis because we had ran this in simulation and our simulation results did not show this. Like there was some correlation with how comfortable you were with a robotic system, so there were some correlating factors of when people would follow the guidance and when people wouldn't. And so that was in simulation, and when we put it in the real world, it shocked us that every single individual followed the guidance of the robot. So we thought, well, maybe they just assumed that the robot knew what it was doing, it was cloud connected, and so it had a map, and so, let's do something a little bit different. Let's do things that are strange, like introducing mistakes into the robot. Clearly, no one would follow the guidance if the robot was obviously making a mistake. And what we found was that this was also not the case. Individuals, and we introduced many different types of mistake, turning in place, having mistakes where they took you to one room and then came out and took you to another room and came out and went to another room. We had issues where it wouldn't move at all, and we had instructors come out and say, student assistants come out and say, oh, sorry, the robot is broken, can we try again? And then they would follow the robot in the second time. And so we enhanced it. We said, okay, again, our hypothesis is wrong. People are quite strange. What can we do? So we enhance the risk of the scenario. Enhanced it intentionally to see what would individuals do. And what we found is we were finally able to break the system. And the only time we were able to break the system was when we introduced the robot for the first time, we introduced a mistake. And so the robot would break down in the middle of the floor, and human had to guide them to the room. And then the robot would take you into a very, what we consider a high-risk environment. And only then did we see that individuals would question themselves. Like they would stop, they wouldn't push the furniture out the way, they would stop and look around, and it was only then. It took a lot to get to the point where individuals wouldn't follow the guidance of the robot. And so this actually concerned us. In the videos, it's like we were looking at it going, I can't believe that my hypothesis is wrong. Like, this is just baffling to us. And so this is also of concern to us because, frankly, we know that robots can improve our quality of life. We definitely know that. But we have this fear that humans, people, society, have this innate trust of these machines. So this was not a socially interactive robot. So we could understand socially interactive, you're putting this human norm, but these were not. And why is that a problem? Well, the problem is, as you know, and you've seen this in the news, humans are trusting and we are biased, and even our algorithms are trained based on us. Right? And so they are biased in many ways and formats. And so our robots have these aspects, like I'm programming them, we're learning from data from clinicians and firefighters, and so these systems are learning our norms, and we're then deploying them into the real world. And so I used to just talk like, yeah, I know, I'm not sure what's going on with this bias, and so we decided to do a tiny study, and it will be interesting that how even now, you might question yourself as you leave. So we said, well, what happens? Can we enhance and understand this bias in the physical form? So not in the virtual form, but in the physical form. And so we showed an agent, so one of our agents that interacts with kids, and we said, describe what it's doing, describe its emotion. And what happens is most times it was like, oh, it's doing a dance, it's happy, it's doing, some individuals named a dance that I didn't even know. And so this was the aspect. And then when we showed another robot and we changed culture, or we changed race, or we changed gender, what happened was people's perspectives changed. And so I'm going to show you another robot, and I'm going to prime you to say, this robot has a race. And what happened was, the output was, it's angry and it's mad. And when we evaluated aspects of trust, it was like, no, I wouldn't use this robot. We did the same with gender. We did the same with nationality, which tells us that it's a robot, it's a machine. It was the same program behavior, same emotions, same dance, and yet us as individuals are biased and we're training it. And so we use the data in terms of interaction for robotic systems. But there is hope. I'm so happy now that we have things like explainable AI and interpretability so that we can start understanding and pushing forward and thinking about these things. Because these machines are going to be out there, they're coming. These humans, us, them, are trusting these machines and their behaviors because they're actually pretty good. And so we are biased, but I think our machines can be better. I think they can understand that and push forward. And so my hope for the future, with all of this information that we know about trust and this aspect of humans are trusting, but they're also biased, my hope is that together that we will get to a better world. And so that's like, I'm sticking to it, and that's my truth. And so with that, I'm out of time. I have to thank my robots, of course. They make my life much easier. They're engaging. They never get mad at me. They never yell at me. I want to thank my students who do get mad at me and who, they don't yell at me, but they do get mad at me, as well as my clinical collaborators. And so if you want to hear more, just not about this story, but about all the things that are happening in terms of this social computing and this aspect of using AI for good, we host a bunch of different experts talking about this. How can we ensure that our algorithms, whether they're ML-based or deep learning-based or AI-based or vision-based, that they have some impact to ensure that our world is a better place. And so with that, I end. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Great talk. An obvious extension of this is in the security arena, particularly in social engineering. So you can use robots. If people have these favorable reactions to robots, then you can use a robot to get a person to do something that's against their interests or the organization's interests. Can you comment on that, please?
So yes, it happens. And I think until we address this and ensure that our agents are doing things that are good and hopefully always good, we're going to continue having these issues. We've shown that there's actually a social aspect of cybersecurity. You can break it or you can enhance it just by having agents being a little more social when they're providing things like password protection and guidance.
Are you or any of your collaborators doing research in this area, like, I don't know, using robots to fish or something like that?
Yes, so Shavik Das at Georgia Tech is looking at artificial agents to enhance behaviors in security.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I was really inspired by your idea that robots don't have to be perfect, but trust is more important when it comes to human-computer interaction. So my first question is, can you extend your idea to robots interaction, like multi-agent robotics? I mean, robots trust robots, or these kind of things. And the second question is, can you think of like multiple robots which has like different characteristic, and then maybe a human can choose which robots to trust. And sometimes one robots tend to be broken, but sometimes it's really super perfect, and another robot is like shows social accuracy every time, and then, human can choose which to trust or something. I mean, can you think of these kind of systems?
Yeah, so there's actually research on multi-agent technology that's using trust as a metric for doing things like surveillance and doing things such as coverage. And so there is work that looks at this aspect of trust in terms of do I trust you to go over into this domain versus another? Different definition of trust. With respect to personalities, there's been research that shows that people will react differently depending on the personality of the robot. Whether it's a dominating robot, whether it's a friendly robot, they will change their behavior differently depending on the personality, which is actually kind of interesting because robots don't have personality.
Thank you very much.
With your study where it showed that people reacted differently to the robot depending on their perception of its race or gender, was that dependent on the people themselves, on their race or gender?
It wasn't, which was amazing. So we had looked toward, now I will say there's a caveat is that it was US-centric. US-centric but still international, but US-centric. There was no, and we tried to find some correlation, there wasn't actually a correlation with respect to their own race or gender, which violated our hypothesis, honestly.
Well, actually, that agrees with studies I've seen where people are analyzing, are determining how effective a teacher was or whether a paper was worth accepting. And they were accepting it based on their perceptions of the gender or race of the person doing it, and it was not dependent on their race or gender.
Yeah, so our study supports that as well.
Thank you.
So I was wondering what it takes to get permission to run some of these experiments.
My longest took a year to get approval, and my shortest has taken 3 months. It actually takes quite a long time to get permission.
Was the fire drill one of the harder ones?
It was, full board review.
Yes.
So if anyone who does full board review is like a terrifying experience, but full board review, many iterations. We actually didn't do the original study. We wanted to go to a abandoned building that was not near campus, and this was the scenario we could come up with that was acceptable.
Okay. More questions? Yes.
How about we have a family robot or personalized with family, not with person, with the individual, with the whole of the family, so it can be increase the trust?
The robots typically have to have a function. So if it's a function that is family-based, then it would increase the trust of individuals that would use that function. But what we find is that it still has to have a function of some sort to change behavior with respect to that.
Thank you for a stimulating talk. The question I have is more around what kind of patience had you encoded in your robots? Because in a clinical setting, and especially some repetitive tasks, humans, even if they're very good, they often lack patience. So I was wondering what role that played, and how did you sort of change the dimensions and the magnitude of the patience the robots had?
Yeah, so we link patience to understanding the emotional state of the child. So it varies. So we don't have like a 5-second. We actually look at the emotional expression, especially with children with autism, that they can quickly go into a frustrated state. We can detect that and intersect.
But did the robot express frustration too?
The robot expresses primarily sadness. Frustration is more empathy.
Right.
So it'll use words and like kind of shrug, but it itself does not express frustration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for such a great talk. I had a question, seems like a conundrum. There's a lot of research that when you're trying to work with kids with special needs, you need to be social. And here we are using a robot to help them out. So this is a really challenging problem for you and your team. How do you solve it?
Well, two things. One is we've shown that in a number of our studies, when the robot is social, we can, and we evaluate the child's social interaction with humans, it actually translates, which is a good thing. In terms of the socialization, that's how we increase trust. And so we do bias the scenario. And we've done experiments where we've had a non-trusting robot or a non-emotional robot and an emotional robot. There are differences with respect to gender and age, believe it or not. We find that there's actually a high correlation between emotions and gender. And you might can guess what it is.
Okay. And have you done like experiments for a longer time, that when you see a kid interacting with a robot for not just like a couple of weeks, but years, and how their interaction change?
Yeah, so we've only done it for 8 weeks. There's a recent study that just came out in Science Robotics, and their study, I believe, was a full year, and that's out of Yale, and that's with children with autism, and they showed the same kind of outcomes. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your awesome talk. Regarding the study that you had with the, in quotes, burning buildings, I asked myself if you have tested the hypothesis that the questionnaire actually created a bias in the participants to follow the robot. Because if I would answer a questionnaire about would I follow a robot, and I answer yes, and then the robot is there to bring me out of an emergency situation, I would follow just because I answered yes before.
Yeah, so interesting enough, the survey results did not match the behavior results. Because we asked surveys beforehand and afterhand, like, you know, and it was based on the navigation stuff. Like, if a robot was navigating, would you X? If you had a self-driving car, would you, right? So we did that before and after, and there was no change in their perception. And in fact, most of them said they wouldn't trust. They said that. And yet their behaviors, and we've codified like some of the videos in terms of the emotional expressions when they like opened up the door and saw the fire and saw the robot. And there's definitely a difference between what individuals say and what their behaviors show.
Thank you.
Hi. When dealing with behavioral modification with an emotional agent, how do you mitigate the effects of limited emotional perception with children with autism?
So with robotic systems, they have shown, and this is in other studies, that by having a repeatable character that is emotional, there's an understanding, and really some of the nuances with children with autism. One, it's not all emotions, just and this is a lot of times the media says, oh, children with autism don't understand emotions, is actually some of the nuances of emotions, like contempt, which is a learned behavior, but things like happiness are universal, no issues with that. And so our robot is doing the form of emotion they're showing is dominant. So it's the happy is definitely happy. There's no subtleties, which is why there's an understanding of the emotion.
So do you use different settings for children who don't have autism?
We do not. Okay. And so in prior work trying to figure out the emotions, we actually looked at interpretation, both adults and kids, to maximize the understanding across all the emotions. And so the set we use is basically the dominant forms of emotion expression.
Okay. Thank you.
One last question.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My thinking is that we inherently trust things like exit signs. You know, I'm in a plane, I see an exit sign, I know if I get it wrong, it's going to be a big problem. Similarly here, if there's a robot that's giving me an exit sign, I would assume that it's gone through your full body review before that. So there is an inherent bias for me to trust it.
Correct, and so we did a study, because you have to do these. So we had a study where we compared exit signs, we compared a humanoid robot, we compared a tablet that was dynamic, that moved, and we compared our tin drum. And what we showed was that, believe it or not, the humanoid robot wasn't as impactful as the tin, like, which is kind of strange. And there's some reasons why after we poked at it, but the sign, it was not even part of the, if I had these 4 options, their behaviors, they wouldn't even follow the sign if the robot said something different.
Okay, let's thank again the speaker, Ayanna.
you.